Hi everybody, it's Cassandra Goldie, CEO from the Australian Council of Social Service, and a very warm welcome from me to the 2021 ACOSS Virtual Post Budget Event. We're really excited. We've had about 500 people registering for this event today to tune in for a really important analysis about the key federal budget measures that were announced last week and their impacts on the Australian community, particularly through the eyes and perspectives of people experiencing poverty and inequality. Look, I'd really like to take this opportunity right up front to thank our event partners, really important support from Bendigo Bank, HESTA and UTS, the Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion, all really important and long-standing partners for ACOSS, and you'll be hearing from a number of them, as well as the media partner for us today, Pro Bono Australia. So thanks to Pro Bono as well. Look, I'd like to also really thank everybody across the ACOSS member network for all the advocacy and important voice and contributions that you've been playing right up into the lead of this federal budget. And today is, of course, a very important chance for us and all the supporters and individuals who've spoken up with the lived experience of being on a low income and facing challenges about what this federal budget really means for the work and the lives of people that bind us together as in terms of our shared purpose. Look, I'm really thrilled that I now have the privilege of introducing to you our event MC, Stela Todorovic. Stella is a fantastic political reporter at Channel 10. Stella and I first met at the National Press Club last year, and Stella, I know, has constantly been looking for the stories and to help to give a platform for people on low incomes to have their say on the issues that really matter. And so really delighted, Stella, that you're able to MC the event today, and I'm handing over to you. Thanks, Stella.
Thank you, Cass, and I'd also really like to very warmly welcome you all to the ACOSS Virtual Post Budget Event. During today's event, we'll be hearing from the Honourable Michael Sukkar. He's the Assistant Treasurer and the Minister for Housing. We'll also hear from Dr. Jim Chalmers, who's the Shadow Treasurer. This will then be followed by the ACOSS budget analysis before we take a deep dive with our panellists into the 2021-22 federal budget. But before we get into all of that, just a few housekeeping tips. There will be several opportunities throughout this webinar for you, the audience, to ask questions of our speakers, the Assistant Treasurer, the Shadow Treasurer, and also the panellists. We encourage you to get involved by simply submitting your question via the question and answer function. You'll find this at the top of your screen, and then I'll ask these questions live. You can also use this function to continue discussions with other members of the audience, or if you have a technical issue or just a question about the event, and someone from the ACOSS team will be sure to get back to you. To begin today's events, I'd like to welcome Brendan Kieran. He'll be delivering the Welcome to Country. Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you for that, Stella. Good afternoon, everyone. He's Brendan Kieran. I'm a cultural representative of Metropolitan and Local Aboriginal Land Council in Redfern. As with my Welcome to Countries, I'd like to very briefly share my connection and story to country. I was born at Crown Street Women's Hospital at Surrey Hills, and that's the last time that I ever saw my mother. I was taken away from her in that hospital, and I've since found I'm one of 10 siblings that have been removed, and I'm second generation that's been removed as well. So my mother, aunties and uncles are all taken as well. So for 40 odd years, I haven't had a traditional tie or connection to country. You might as well say I'm an Eora man. Lived in Sydney my whole life, love Sydney, very patriotic when it comes to Sydney. I have in my journey of identity found my mother's grave down at a place called Denton, and my traditional ties to country are from Lake Victoria, down on the borders of South Australia and Victoria, and Murrawara language group of the Barkindji Nation. Barka meaning Darling River, Barkindji meaning Darling River people. The clan Barkindji goes right through and up the Darling River to Wilkenya. When we hit Wilkenya, they're a different Barkindji, they're a different language group, they're Malian Yapa. So we traditionally come from the lake country and they're from the stone country. I always say to people that we're the better looking group out of the two. And look, that's my connection to country. I've met 3 brothers and 1 sister. None of us talk due to, you know, traumas and things that have happened in our life journey. But today I'm gathered. Metro is situated on Gadigal land, and Gadigal is one of the 29 language groups which make up the Eora Nation. The boundaries for the Eora Nation start from the beautiful Sydney Harbour and are surrounded by 3 of the world's most beautiful rivers, the Hawkesbury River, the Nepean River, and the Georges River. And in between those 3 mighty and beautiful rivers, we have 29 language groups which make up the Eora Nation, and the name of the language group that I'm situated on is Gadigal. So on behalf of Metropolitan Aboriginal Land Council, on behalf of its members and the board, I'd like to welcome everyone here this afternoon. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future and emerging. And look, it's always an honour for me to perform a welcome to country, because 10 years ago I wouldn't have had this opportunity or this platform to, you know, make an acknowledgement of country or perform a welcome to country. So as a nation, it's shown me that, you know, as a nation, we're moving forward in the way of that recognition and acknowledgement. We could move a lot faster, but at least we're moving forward. And look, I know for a fact that 10 years ago, you would definitely have never had a welcome to country performed by such a good-looking bloke as myself. So on behalf of Metro and on behalf of myself, welcome. And thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I mean, today marks exactly 2 years since the federal election and that miracle win for the federal government. I might bring Cass Goldie back in just to talk through some of these big issues that we've seen in the federal budget. We've seen a lot of spending going towards aged care, women's security, economic security. Half of that is childcare. Cass, what are the biggest takeaways you've had from this federal budget?
Well, look, Stella, as I know we're waiting for the Assistant Treasurer. He is on his way any minute now, and so certainly as soon as he arrives, we'll hand back to you, Stella. But of course, ACOSS and our members always brought to this federal budget the analysis and the views about the experience and what was needed to deliver for the country, and to particularly focus on the needs of people on really low incomes and who are experiencing disadvantage. And, you know, there's been some extraordinary demonstrations of what governments are capable of doing when they really want to. So last year during that pandemic, of course, we saw the doubling of the rate of job seeker and all the extraordinary benefits that it flowed from that. And then, you know, virtually, not overnight, but with a lot of hard effort from both layers of government and the community sector, we helped to house people. For the first time, we 40,000 people were housed in order for us to ensure that everybody really was able to self-isolate. And so I think there was something that really was so important about the sense of we really were in it together. There were some people who were really left behind, as you know, people on temporary visas, and some of those people that didn't get access to JobKeeper. But now in this federal budget, we had always said we wanted to see a federal budget that didn't bring back austerity, and I think that is what we've got, at least at this moment, and that we wanted a government that stayed the course now of investing properly in the things that were really important and that would help us to create and to continue to open up job opportunities. So that notion of having an unemployment target as a core purpose of a federal budget was something we'd really called for. We wanted a federal target that was even more ambitious than what the government set, no question about that. And then, of course, the big question is how will we get there? So this investment in care services, really crucial. Is it enough? I think we're going to hear a bit more about that. Of course, what many will be talking about is, there's a lot of the spending is on the tax cut side and the business tax cut side, but none of that helps people who are on really low income. So I'm very aware that we've got the Assistant Treasurer, Michael, who just joined us. So Michael, I was just giving a bit of an overview until you were able to join us. So welcome. Great to have you with us. Stela Todorovic is going to be emceeing the session, but I gather you're here. I can hear your voice anyway. You there?
Oh, hi, Cassandra. Yeah, okay. Just perpetual IT issues, but I think we're there.
Always. Well, delighted that it was you that the tech issues hit, Michael. There you go. See? All right. Thanks very much to the Assistant Treasurer for joining us, and back to you, Stella. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Cass, for that, and thank you, Minister Sukkar, for joining us. Please take it away.
Well, Stella, thanks so much for today, and Cassandra, thank you for the invitation. And can I particularly acknowledge the great work you do in Canberra. You're very direct, you're very forceful. You let us know what you think about any particular policy or issue, but the way in which you engage with the government very directly, honestly, in a really decent and fair and respectful way. I just wanted to acknowledge and thank you for that. And we've obviously had a bit to do with each other over the years, so I just wanted to acknowledge and thank that. Hello to everyone there today. It's a really great honour to be able to speak on behalf of the government at today's budget address. I know the Treasurer, who I just spoke to this morning, and Minister Ruston both asked me to extend their apologies for being unable to join you today. I'm very honoured to be able to do it in their stead, and they're very keen to join you at future forums and future discussions just like this. So, we're very grateful as a team for the work you do. In setting the scene for Tuesday night and the measures and the individual measures, that some of which I'll mention in more detail today, I think it's a good place to start is to think back to this time last year and a little bit earlier at the height of the pandemic. And I think given how successful we've been, both from a health perspective and an economic perspective, it's easy to forget or dismiss just how dire the outlook was a year ago. And whilst it was an extraordinarily difficult year for so many people, we all know it could have been and was projected to be so much worse. Unemployment, we feared, would rise to 15%, and you all understand the social dislocation that would have led to. The economy was predicted to contract by more than 20%, and those projections that were in place for Australia are sadly real life scenarios that we're seeing played out around the world. We acted really decisively. I think any fair-minded person can agree. We acted very decisively in our response to the pandemic. We very much focused on keeping Australians in jobs, keeping businesses alive and helping them get through across the bridge of the pandemic, and enhancing support for those who needed it most, and indeed supporting those people for whom you at ACOSS fight so hard for. Whether it was the JobKeeper program, which supported 3.8 million people, the coronavirus supplement under JobSeeker, which supported 1.5 million people, the cash flow boost supporting 800 businesses, and importantly also supported a number of not-for-profits as well, who obviously were called on even more during the pandemic. And in my own portfolio, the Home Builder program, which incentivised more than $30 billion worth of direct construction activity and broader economic benefits of over $100 billion, plus an extra $1 billion that we put into the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation to support social and affordable housing. We acted decisively. There's since been some critics out there around the quantum of spending that the government engaged in, but we thought that was crucially important for the reasons that I outlined. But, you know, the budgets in the end are not really about numbers. They're about the people that sit behind them. And it's easy when we're bandying around billions and tens of billions and indeed talking about trillions in this day and age to forget about the people that sit behind them and be a little bit overwhelmed by it. But in the end, our view and what drove us around the ERC table in putting together this budget were the people that sat behind it, whether it was for more security for pensioners, better conditions for carers, dignity and self-worth for those living in aged care, and we've all witnessed some of the issues there, empowerment and purpose for our veterans, and of course, increasing support for those who need it most. And as the Treasurer said on the night, the budget builds on this unprecedented support that we put in place during the pandemic and goes further to create jobs, to guarantee, importantly, the essential services, and to build a more resilient and secure Australia. It delivers, as I think I might have got the tail end of Cassandra's remarks, personal income tax cuts, business tax incentive, new apprenticeships and training places at a scale we have not seen before, more infrastructure, and of course record funding for schools, hospitals, aged care, mental health and the NDIS. We think that these measures will help secure our recovery, a line that you heard many, many times, I'm sure, on budget night and since, but it does encapsulate the rationale and thinking behind the budget to secure the recovery and, of course, to drive down the number of people who are either unemployed or underemployed. I think 2020 probably taught something to many people that we understood at an intellectual level, but perhaps less so at a visceral level, and that is the connection and relationship between a healthy population and a healthy economy and a happy society. And so it goes without saying that success on the health front has been the foundation upon which we've been able to secure our economic recovery. And in Tuesday night's budget, we've placed even more priority on protecting Australian lives and containing the spread of the virus, which I think is very timely when you consider public remarks just today or just this morning that I was reading, which seemed to take a bit of a contrary view to really putting at the top of our list protecting Australians' health. But this budget included almost $2 million additional investment to secure access, as we all know, to about 170 million additional vaccine doses, as well as 1.5 billion to extend the COVID health response until the end of 2021. And there was a range of measures, many of which you've probably used, including telehealth and others, which are significant investments that were triggered by the pandemic, but are now to some extent, I think, going to be likely to be permanent features of our health system. As Cassandra was saying, and as I highlighted, we did place a huge emphasis on tax cuts. And as the PM and Treasurer have really at pains to emphasise, this is a joint health and economic crisis, and you need the strong economy to be able to fund not only the health response, but some of the other important measures that go to our social cohesion and looking after and providing a safety net for those who need it the most. Almost 1 million jobs have been added since the peak of the crisis. The unemployment rate is forecast to get back to pre-crisis levels just 2 years after its peak. And I think in that sense, it's worth remembering, and this is certainly not a criticism of the former government, but it's worth remembering that following the GFC, the unemployment rate never actually got back to where it was pre-GFC. And that's not, the reason why that's not a particular criticism of that government is that typically in significant economic downturns and recessions, it takes much longer to get those jobs back. So the fact that we've been able to do that in such a short time is a great credit to the economic response, which has been aided by the health response. Target unemployment, as you saw in the budget, is now below 5%. We know getting there won't be easy, but that's why the budget continues to support middle income workers with tax cuts to enhance aggregate demand, which we know is going to be so important for confidence of the economy more broadly. And in that sense, we're obviously extending the the lower middle income tax offset. This will benefit around 10.2 million Australians with a taxable income below $90,000. It'll be an additional $1,080 for individuals, $2,160 for couples, and that increased aggregate demand is just going to flow through to the broader economy. It will also, as tax relief for individuals, will be coupled with $20 billion in tax relief for small businesses, again, ensuring that we can lock in the recovery and create the jobs that we need to get the unemployment rate under 5%. It's crucially important that we provided those incentives to enhance that confidence as well. But the economic activity that we're hoping for and the job creation we are aiming for needs a ready-to-go workforce. So we've committed more support for foundation skills so that any job seeker can receive training in literacy, numeracy and digital skills. We're investing further in a job trainer fund, adding 163,000 places and extending the program until the end of next year. And by removing the cap on the number of trainees and apprentices under the $2.7 billion expansion to the Boosting Apprenticeship Commencement Scheme, we're also importantly providing more pathways for young people and retraining those to find really meaningful employment. We're also modernising our employment services to better match job seekers to jobs, and we're increasing the wage subsidy for long-term unemployed job seekers from $6,500 to $10,000. So in essence, by matching incentives to employ with skill development and better modernising services, we think we can put our best forward to securing the economic recovery and driving the unemployment down, which has such a huge social benefit as well. We also think that the economic strategy must, in order to be successful, must prioritise women, and the participation of women in the workforce is fundamental. The budget therefore commits nearly $2 billion to support women's economic security and leadership, and I want to commend the great work of Maurice Payne and the whole team, as well as an additional $1.7 billion to improve childcare affordability and $351 million into health and wellbeing. Whilst improved childcare affordability is not exclusively a women's issue, it's a family issue, it will benefit so many families with young children who face the highest barriers to participate in the labour market. And in that sense, we think it's a very important productivity measure which delivers and will deliver really tangible benefits and help, again, to lead to what we're hoping to do, which is to drive unemployment as low as it possibly can be. But to participate in the workforce, women need to be safe, which is also why we're investing $1 billion into the Women's Safety Package. There's 16 measures, and I can assure you that a great deal of work has gone into this over many, many months. So we're delivering more emergency accommodation, increased legal assistance, better access to counselling, financial support, including cash payments for those who are escaping abusive relationships, improved targeted services for Indigenous, migrant and refugee women and those with disabilities. We're also improving the family law system to protect children, give victims of domestic violence greater access to justice, and importantly, to reduce the time that they spend in court. The budget builds on the $130 million already provided to states last year for frontline domestic violence services, and the $340 million under the Fourth Action Plan for the National Plan to reduce violence against women and children. So again, measures that dovetail into the broader strategy of participation, looking after the whole person and trying to support people, particularly women who are facing domestic violence and other abusive relationships. Another big part of the budget has been, and there's been varying commentary on this aspect of the budget, but focusing on essential services and making significant investments into those essential services. So I think COVID taught us all the primacy and the importance of health, as I've said at the beginning, but a particular aspect of people's health being their mental health, which is why we're making a record investment of more than $2 billion into mental health prevention and resiliency services, suicide prevention, and expanded treatment options. And to help us work towards our stated goal of zero suicides in Australia, we're establishing the National Suicide Prevention Office to provide a nationally consistent whole of government approach to prevention. And we also, as I outlined, again, looking after the whole person, want to ensure that older Australians receive the care that they deserve. So this has been a priority of the government for a number of years. It obviously culminated with the Royal Commission, but as you would have seen, since the 18-19 budget, which predated the Royal Commission, we've committed and delivered 83,000 additional home care places. In this budget, we committed, as you know, I'm sure many of you followed it, a record funding increase of $17.7 billion to improve the quality, safety and provision of aged care services. And importantly, it's not about just putting more money into a flawed system, but putting more money in to help reform the system to improve it. So there will be an additional $6.5 billion for more 80,000 additional home care packages, $8 billion to reform residential care, again, more money to reform, not just to continue a flawed system, because we really need to ensure that we restore trust in the system, because I think one thing that's above politics and ideology and philosophy of politics is the idea that as Australians we want the people who have built this country to age with dignity and respect. We're also expanding and spending a further $13.2 billion over 4 years to meet the needs of Australians with a disability. So this will focus on ensuring the sustainability of the NDIS so that it can improve and continue to deliver the high quality of essential services. I'll just end my address touching on housing. In addition to the $2.7 billion for Home Builder, which I alluded to as being one of the really key planks of the immediate economic response, the budget will help another 10,000 first home buyers to build a new home with a 5% deposit. That supports the industry and also supports people into home ownership. We've also announced improvements to the First Home Super Saver scheme to enable people to save, to get over that deposit hurdle by expanding it from $30,000 to $50,000 per individual. It's just essentially a savings mechanism with a concessional tax rate to allow people to save more quickly for a deposit. And for your average couple, it means they can accelerate their savings by about $21,000 in tax savings and deemed returns, which is really important. Another announcement was that under the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement, we're also providing an additional nearly $125 million in funding, which will, in the end, allow the states and territories to bolster their public housing stocks or to meet their social and community housing responsibilities under the 2011 Fair Work decision on social and community services wages. And I know there was quite a significant campaign on this, and we were certainly always minded to provide this additional funding on the caveat that the states use it properly, and I'm very confident that they will. But in finishing, I think the policy that I'm most proud of in the housing space in the budget is our policy to support single parents and the Family Home Guarantee, which will support single parents to purchase a home with a 2% deposit. It's based on the very successful First Home Loan Deposit Scheme and allows eligible single parents with dependent children to enter, or in some cases re-enter, the housing market to provide a secure home environment for themselves and their children. Single parent households have lower home ownership rates than other household types, with almost half of all single parent families renting from a private landlord. And these are policies to support renters and first home buyers, but not those who have just fallen out of home ownership or who've never been owners, but those who after a relationship breakdown, find themselves in circumstances where they, again, just cannot get over that deposit hurdle. So a really important policy, the Family Home Guarantee, we think it's going to be extraordinarily popular. We think there's going to be a lot of take-up. With record low interest rates, there is a once in a generation opportunity to turn single parents, 84% of which are women, from renters into homeowners, in most cases modest homes, but in homeowners where their mortgage repayments are no greater or if not less than what they're paying in rent. So a really important policy. So we think this is a budget for the times. There's been a lot of commentary about this being a budget where we've made a lot of investments and spent a lot of taxpayers' money, but it's a budget for the times. It sets the stage in our economic plan to get us through COVID-19. This is a second pandemic budget, but also to lock in the gains and move forward. It focuses again, in conclusion, on creating jobs, guaranteeing those essential services, and building an even more resilient Australia. We've got a lot more to do, and no doubt Cassandra will be reminding us on a very regular basis of what those extra things that we need to do are. But I think Australians can be really proud when we turn on the news each night and look at what's happening around the world from a health perspective, from an economic perspective, and importantly, from a political and social cohesion perspective. I think we can be really proud that when we talk about doing things in a uniquely Australian way, that in most cases means doing it better than most of the world. And it's something I'm really proud of. It's something we all collectively own. And the Morrison government's very keen to make sure that we lock that in and drive it forward even further. So thank you so much for having me today. Stella, over to you. I'm very happy to take questions.
Well, thank you so much for your address, and I'm seeing some of the audience questions already filtering in, so we will go back to housing. First, though, I'd like to touch base on job seeker skills and that skills shortage that we are seeing across Australia. From April this year, we did see that job seeker payment increase by $50 a fortnight, and credit where credit is due, Minister. You know, it is the first increase we've seen, the largest increase we've seen since 1986. But with due respect, would you be able to live off of $44 a day?
Thanks, Stella. I mean, that's a question we hear very often. In the end, we provide a range of payments, not just, and I'm sure you've all heard this answer before, we provide not just the coronavirus supplement as it was during the pandemic or the job seeker payment as we do now. That is often combined with a range of payments. So, you know, we're realistic about the costs and the pressures of trying to survive on and thrive, we hope, and use as a, as a step up on welfare payments. And so what we do is we combine a whole range of support. In my own portfolio, we spend $5.5 billion a year on Commonwealth rental assistance. It's not something, to be frank, that we issue media releases about. It's not something that gets front page headlines. Obviously, job seeker is the sort of payment that's on the tip of everybody's tongue and leads to questions like that. But we combine a whole range of payments because we recognise that, that payments at a level that enable people to live and to get job ready and to take a step forward. So, in most cases, I think the latest data, Cassandra will correct me if I'm wrong, but the latest data is more than 90% of recipients are on multiple payments, not just job seekers. So, I think that is recognition that the system, for want of a better term, accepts what sort of costs are associated with being able to live and take that next step. So, I think that's probably the best answer that I can give to that question because, we all understand the pressures of the budget, And I think the $50 a fortnight increase, you know, I saw ACOSS's comments. It certainly didn't meet their expectations, but as the single largest increase, I think is recognition of the sorts of questions that you've just asked, Stella.
Of course, I'm sure you can understand with the coronavirus supplement ending and this slight increase that those living in poverty once again can't pull themselves out or can find it very difficult to pull themselves out. As you mentioned, this is the second pandemic budget. So you'll still need to see some 1.3 million Australians get out of income support and into secure work. So what further steps is the government willing to take to support these people, whether it's, you know, employment assistance and training, of course, but what if they find themselves at the back of that training and that assistance still without a job?
Well, Stella, I think we have to, marry two objectives, which I really tried to touch on in my speech. We need to, yes, have a system that incentivises and is seeking to drive unemployment down below 5%, because, that's no more important than now at an economic level, as opposed to even at a human level, where we all have a desire to see that happen, to see people fulfil their own ambitions. We think the investments we've made into training, the reforms we've made to matching employers and employees, the incentives we've provided employers as well, as I touched on, from 6,500 to 10,000, to incentivise employers to take a punt on someone who they might be a bit unsure about. We think they are the best measures to try and dovetail the sort of objective you're talking about. Now, in the end, there will always be people who, through circumstance, being unlucky in many instances, will be at the back of that queue. And I think we have a broad-based welfare system that provides them with support. But what we've seen in this budget is the government saying, well, you know what, we are going to invest, amounts we've not seen before in trying to support you, help you retrain or train for the first time, upskill, help you pivot from a job you might have been doing for many decades that no longer exists. And I think that's the best thing that the federal government can do: have expectations, but also, as a nation, provide people with everything that they need to put their best foot forward. I know that sounds a bit like a politician's answer, I suppose, but I do truly believe it. I think there has to be, I think in the past with job seekers, and I'm not just talking about in the recent past, I'm probably talking for the last 3 decades. I think we've had a lot of expectations, and we've really forcefully placed those expectations on job seekers, but we probably haven't thrown as many resources as we should have in actually matching that expectation with providing them what they needed to take the next step in retraining or reskilling. I think this budget does that. The proof will in the end be in the pudding, but I can assure you, with borders where they are, with skilled migration being where it is, we actually don't have the luxury now of having unfulfilled talent on the sidelines here in Australia, where we've got talented individuals who are in a difficult situation right now. We actually need to harness that talent and help them find a way into a fulfilling job, because of the constraints we have in accessing, labour from offshore. So it's such an economic imperative, but it just dovetails so neatly into really what I think ACOSS is all about, and that's caring about the individual and the person and helping them try and fulfil, their ambitions. And, I think if there's one message we can give Australians is that there's a lot of people out there who are looking for work, who are not in jobs, who are being supported, but who have an abundance of ability and talent. And we've I think we've put our best foot forward now in this budget to try and harness that talent and support them into work.
Okay, you've mentioned training and resources. An area that really needs more training and more resources is the aged care sector. This budget does have a significant package for aged care. It's still short of what was recommended in the Royal Commission, but how do you ensure that staff is going to be well trained and paid well, keeping in mind that this is a job that receives an hourly rate that's among the lowest in Australia?
Yeah, look, it's a very fair point, and I was at an aged care facility this morning actually, and look, I think what we've seen in this package is a couple of things. Yes, a significant headline investment, but then when you dive into the detail and look at some of the aspects of the package, it's been really carefully thought through of how do you ensure that the entire industry, with higher expectations that we have, and we are certainly imposing higher expectations on our aged care providers, how they practically meet that. And that, obviously, the most significant part of that will be workforce capability and workforce numbers. Obviously, there's now specific requirements on the number of minutes of care at certain levels. That's going to mean that a significant effort on an industry-wide basis will need to be there to grow that capability, no doubt. As far as standards go, embedded in the package is a significant reform, but work that will have to, will commence. Reform to ensure that we're able to measure those standards, that we're able to audit them on a more regular basis in a more robust way, more spot audits. So it's again, to sort of go back to that kind of hackneyed view of higher expectations, yes, but higher expectations that are met with higher resources. So an extra $10 a day for aged care providers per person. In most cases, that extra money will be, every bit of it will be required by those aged care providers to raise their standards. It's not going to be a windfall for them. It's to raise standards and to help equip them to raise those standards. So we could have been very heavy-handed and said, well, you've got to, these are the expectations that we have, and you've got to meet this bar. But without those extra resources and parameters, I don't think it would have been realistic. So we've tried to match that with the higher standards. The worst thing we could have done, I think, Stella, is put more money into a bad system. I think had we done that, there might have been some beneficiaries along the way, but the beneficiaries might not have been the aged care residents. I think the way we've targeted this package gives us the best chance to do that, and there's so much work to be done to implement these, and I think there'll be some growing pains along the way, but we've, at the heart of it is workforce capability and workforce numbers, and I think the extra resources, I think the industry is going to need every bit of those extra dollars to deliver that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's so much more to unpack there. I could speak to you about this all afternoon, but we do need to get to some audience questions. I think we've got time for just one. A fair few filtering in about social housing. So I'll throw this one at you. What is the federal government going to do to enable low-income families, especially sole parent families headed by women, to avoid homelessness, given that there was no mention in the budget of providing social housing or genuine assistance to families who cannot afford the ever-increasing price of rentals and completely unattainable housing prices?
Well, Stella, I mean, what we've done over a number of years in this space is probably the biggest incursion into this space from a federal government in living memory. We established in 2017, as you all know, the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation. It, for the first time, gave us a vehicle to try and achieve a whole lot of the objectives that we had, primarily to support our community housing providers and the community housing sector, which, in my view, just really achieves great efficiencies and provides great wraparound services to the individuals who they support. So we established a great entity and mechanism to support those people. And since then, we've been pretty assiduously working to ensure that that NIFIC actually is able to deliver on its mandate. It was just on the weekend, just a few days after the budget, we announced a project where NIFIC is supporting with $400 million a project in Victoria, which will see 1,100 new social and affordable houses. Again, we do it, we work on these deals all the time. It was just coincidence that the Victorian government chose to announce it last week. We've delivered over 10,000 either new or support for existing social and affordable housing dwellings. Again, I don't put out a media release every time we get one of these projects done. These are supporting really important cohorts in our society, not just single mothers with dependent children, but older women. I was at a project where NIFIC had supported, which was really designed to help retired women who were in housing stress, to assist them with a home that in most cases they will have for the rest of their lives. We've also provided funding through NIFIC for key workers. So those people who make our cities livable, the people who work on the front line, but who are often in jobs that mean it's very difficult for them to purchase a home, in the area in which they service. So we've done over 10,000 of these, and it's again, I think, one of the more significant things we've done. We don't talk about it all the time. Perhaps I should speak about it much more, but I know those in the community housing sector look at it really closely. Importantly, we try to leverage relationships with state governments. It's a state and territory responsibility, but we're happy to, and we believe we have a role to play in providing them the firepower they need to make further investments. And so what we do is we make our funding conditional on co-investment, either from a state level or from a community housing provider. And so what that does is it leverages the benefit for the community. The worst thing that you could do in this space is for every dollar of additional Commonwealth investment, see a retreat from our state and territory governments, because that means you don't have any net benefit. And over the last couple of decades, we've seen a bit of that happening. I'm not accusing any states or territories of doing it at the moment, because I think we've all accepted we've got a model now through the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation that requires that co-investment. So over 10,000, Stella, in the last 2.5 years, 10,000 new dwellings, supporting in many cases and having a particular focus for single parents and single women and older women. I'm very happy to keep talking about those things. We're already doing it, so we accept that it's an area of significant need, it was the primary reason that we established this new entity. And I note that the opposition, who made some commitments at the budget in relation to social housing, a commitment that requires some very heroic returns out of that fund. In fact, based on their figures, would require a return of over 20% out of the future fund to deliver on the targets they've given, when the future fund has a benchmark return of 6% at the moment. So heroic is perhaps even a kind way of putting what their costings are with that policy. But even in their policy, they are using the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation as the vehicle. So the Labor Party has accepted that this creation of the Morrison government, this new housing body, which is already delivering more than 10,000 homes, is the right model. I assume that's why they have used it in their own policy. So we accept, Stella, that that's an area of great need. But in addition to what the questioner said, I think older women too is a significant focus for the government as well.
Thank you so much for your time, Assistant Treasurer Michael Sukkar. We are now due to go to the Shadow Treasurer, so I will thank you here, and it's an absolute pleasure to bring in Jim Chalmers.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Shadow Treasurer, when you're ready, please. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Stella, and thanks, Cass, Goldie, and everybody for the invitation to spend some time with you today. I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Yugambeh and the Yagara people, so I acknowledge the traditional owners. I wanted to take you back to the beginning of last year with those bushfires that brought so much devastation the summer before last. And I remember that some of the worst affected families at the time said that they felt like they were forgotten when the cameras left their town and their community. And I kind of feel like now, as the memories fade of last year's, or the worst part of last year's recession, too many vulnerable Australians face a similar fate. Too many are at risk of being left behind. Too many sacrificed to the government's smug self-satisfaction around the budget. Now, bushfires and poverty are obviously not the same, but both are disastrous. Both rob communities of what they value most. And in my view, the Prime Minister takes responsibility for neither of those things. In his words, he doesn't hold a hose, but he doesn't have a heart either. And I think we saw that in last week's budget. In aggregate, as people know, the economy is recovering, and that's a really good thing. But we want more Australians to get a slice of the action, more Australians to get a slice of that recovery. And for 2 million Australians who can't find a job or enough work, or those caught in long-term unemployment at 20-year highs, it still feels like a recession. And besides, it's not a recovery if we just go back to the type of inequality and immobility which has characterised much of the last 8 long years of Liberal government. It's not a recovery if aspiration is only afforded to those already halfway up the ladder, or if real wages go backwards, or if disadvantage is left to concentrate in communities and cascade through the generations. So I think we can be more ambitious for the disadvantaged than to just hope for things to go back to how they were before COVID-19. Too many were struggling before, and too many are still struggling now. And even in a budget characterised by $100 billion in new spending and marked by $1 trillion in debt, Australians doing it tough were barely an afterthought in that budget. So I guess what I wanted to say about all that is you can expect a very different approach to poverty and disadvantage from Labor. We won't just pretend it away, we will act with purpose to alleviate it. We will take responsibility for it in government. And you expect that already, I'm assuming, from great people like Linda Burney and from a core economic team comprising people like Katie Gallagher and Stephen Jones and Andrew Lee and Matt Thistlethwaite, and from a leader who grew up in social housing with a single parent. But I wanted to say you can expect it from me as well. As Treasurer, you can expect me to take a deep interest and for my Treasury Department to be heavily involved, working hand in hand with Linda and her department to make a tangible difference to people's lives. And what concerns all of us in our team is that despite that growth in aggregate prosperity over the last generation or so, globalisation and technology-led disruption threaten a further polarising of opportunity in Australia. And this polarisation, as many of you know, has many characteristics, but one of the most obvious is being the geographic concentrations of advantage and disadvantage. Those places connected into industries that are benefiting from global knowledge and technology are going forward, and those that aren't are falling behind. And we've seen that right across the advanced economies. Analysis from the IMF suggests that these disparities have been rising across advanced economies since the late 1980s. And that, as we know from around the world, has been feeding and fueling a lot of political discontent as well. In general, to oversimplify, the inner suburbs are going relatively well, but it's a much more mixed picture in outer suburban and regional areas with huge variation in local economies, social conditions and life opportunities. According to Tony Vincent, just 3% of Australian communities bear the bulk of our society's burden of disadvantage. And I know what this concentrated disadvantage looks like. I grew up amongst it in the electorate that I represent today. And in my home state of Queensland, half of the least advantaged people live in just 4 places: Moreton Bay, Bundaberg, Ipswich, and my hometown of Logan City. In fact, around 10% of the least well-off Queenslanders live within 3 kilometres of this electorate office, and almost the same amount again in the next ring of adjoining suburbs. Now, you all have your own experiences of concentrated and cascading disadvantage to draw on, and I wanted to pay tribute to the work that you do in those communities. You wouldn't be here on this call if you didn't already know the what and the why this matters. But today, from a Labor perspective, I wanted to give you a sense of some principles behind the how. And first, I want to acknowledge that income support is a really crucial part of this story. Having spent most of the past 2 years campaigning to raise the rate, I know how important it is that JobSeeker is adequate. We all saw the benefits it brought people and their communities when the supplement was introduced. Now, not all of you agree with our current position on JobSeeker, and I acknowledge that too. I want to assure you that Cass and her team have kept the pressure on, and we want to work with you on JobSeeker, not against you. But as important as income support is, it's not the full story. It's not the only lever. And whether you call it the architecture of opportunity, as others have, or the scaffolding around social mobility, as I do, there are a number of other ways we can tackle disadvantage, and I want to spend some time on those, particularly on three that are particularly relevant for us today. The first one is housing. And after 8 years of this government, housing affordability, as you know, has gotten worse, and there are more homeless Australians than ever before. And that's why Anthony Albanese announced our plan last week to create a $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund. And over the first 5 years, it will build around 30,000 social and affordable homes. And that'll make a difference in remote Indigenous communities, for crisis and transitional housing for women and children fleeing violence, and older women on low incomes who are at risk of homelessness. And it will also build housing and fund specialist services for veterans who are experiencing homelessness or who are at risk. So that's an important first priority in housing, and we've said a lot about that in the last week. A second priority is dealing with concentrated disadvantage. In recent years, because of the success of programs like Logan Together here in my community and others associated with the Australia Together Alliance, I've become a really big believer in place-based initiatives. In these places, local, targeted and differentiated strategies are needed, and they can only be delivered through the kind of localised planning, decision-making and investment that goes with a place-based approach. And place approaches are a reimagining of government, and they can reinvigorate the relationship between government and community. And because disadvantage has become so concentrated, a place strategy that supported 10 communities in each state and territory could benefit over 50% of all Australians facing adversity. And we could likely do this aspect of it without more spending. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, the welfare services spend is around $50 billion when you combine the Commonwealth and the states. In target communities, case studies have estimated this spend per person is around $42,000. In Logan, 100 separate investments in children and families have been tracked, and they're welcome, but there's hardly any system-level coordination. And despite all of this spending for big swathes of our community, things haven't necessarily gotten any better. Tony Vincent, again, studied locational disadvantage for over 40 years. The list of suburbs he studied in the 70s is almost the same list as the last report in 2015. Glyn Davis's book, called On Life's Lottery, highlighted that startling statistic that people born into poverty in Australia are 5 times more likely to suffer adult poverty. And progress against some of the Closing the Gaps targets is glacial. Child wellbeing data for Queensland shows kids in high SES communities are improving, while kids in low SES communities are going the other way. And because we've got Logan Together, we're helping to hold back that tide, but there's still heaps of work to be done. And that's why I'm a believer in place-based strategies. Recent studies, inquiries and reports, including work by the Productivity Commission, have identified these place-based solutions as an opportunity to change outcomes and get better for bang for buck in social spending. And existing programs are a good start, but they need more leadership to move from the fringes to the centre of the way that our public service operates. So what could we do differently? Look, I'm conscious that these are programs in the department that Linda Burney shadows. But in our conversations with Linda and with other leaders associated with the Australia Together Alliance and other collaborations, some possible steps have emerged. We could consolidate these place-based approaches into a national framework and move them to the centre of social and economic policy. We can involve the Treasury more substantially and use national cabinet to drive it across jurisdictions. We could resource these frameworks through these bodies. Those that work could be scaled up and replicated in other high-risk communities we identify and those that emerge. We could strike a better balance between interest from Canberra and devolved local decision-making and investment coordination and service redesign. Data sharing would be an important part of it, as would professional development in the public sector. Local community leadership, cultural governance and shared decision-making across government, community and NGOs would be essential features. Obviously, we'd need to involve civil society organisations. Perhaps we could have community deals, each with a mandate to drive these strategies in the most disadvantaged communities over a long period. The deals could be co-governed by government, civil society and community leaders. They could combine funding and data from across the Commonwealth and participating state and local agencies. We could make these policy and reform recommendations flow in both directions to central government agencies. These are all the sorts of ways that we could make some of these place-based initiatives work on the ground in communities like this one that I'm coming to you from today. Now, at its best, that government leadership with a place-based approach can catalyse socially minded private capital and investment as well. And that's why the third opportunity I want to touch on today is impact investing. Impact investors around the world have seen the importance of a place-based approach for revitalising economic development. In mature markets like the US and UK, impact investors have provided patient capital and support for organisations to finance housing, community education, health centres and clean energy projects in disadvantaged communities. This is also happening closer to home. There's an example up the road here in Toowoomba of a place called Vanguard Laundry Services, which is a commercial laundry creating employment opportunities for people who've been excluded from work, largely because of mental health conditions. It's a program deeply embedded in that local community in Toowoomba. And many of the workers were unemployed before they started there. And the program has been able to retain those workers at a much higher rate than other employment services programs. So these three ideas I've touched on, Stella, before we get to a couple of questions, are really united by our recognition that disadvantage is greater than the sum of its component parts, and so must the solutions be as well. We need to be collaborative. We need to have a very different relationship between government and the community sector. And Labor values your work, your advice and your advocacy, and we want to work with local organisations and we want to put cooperation over competition. Because as we emerge from this recession, we should seize the opportunity to make the economy and our society stronger, more inclusive and more sustainable after COVID-19 than it was before. We need to make sure that more Australians can get ahead in the recovery and aren't left behind. The Prime Minister, the Treasurer, this government, the Minister we heard from before are either unwilling or unable to understand that. And that's why we feel the budget was a missed opportunity and a really expensive one at that.
Thank you so much for your time, Shadow Treasurer, and for that address. The one question that keeps filtering through, and I have to say it's one that's on my mind, you have gone through these three pillars, the Labor policy for tackling disadvantage if you were to come into government, but everyone really wants to know, do you think the current job seeker rate is too low, and would a Labor government raise that rate? We do know that ahead of the 2019 election, which was exactly 2 years ago today, that the then Labor leader Bill Shorten all but promised to raise the rate upon review. What's the party's stance now?
Well, we've said a few times now, Stella, since the government announced the new permanent rate, that obviously a Labor government would always prefer to do better for people on unemployment benefits than the government. We've also been upfront and said we need to weigh that against all of the other priorities that are coming at us. One of the difficulties we have in replacing or seeking to replace a government which is 8 years old now, and by the time of the next election we'll be asking for 12, is that it will be impossible to undo all of the damage done in that period overnight. So we need to think about priorities, we need to think about sequencing, we need to think about what we want to do immediately and what needs to wait for later. And so we haven't come to a final position on the job seeker rate. I think people on the call understand that, or at least have heard us say that. We would like to do better for the most disadvantaged people in our society and government. And also, as I said in my speech, I think as important as income support is, it's obviously absolutely crucial, as I've said again and again, and also in the last 2 years campaigning for that higher rate than the old $40 a day New Start, is that we also need to be able to think more broadly about what else we can be doing too.
Julie Collins is asking, she says, I would like to know what the policy will be for the abolition of the cashless debit card and other forms of forced income management on Centrelink recipients. Do you have a response for Ms Collins?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. You've got the same name as one of my favourite colleagues, Julie Collins, my colleague in the Shadow Cabinet. Look, we don't support the extension of the cashless debit card. I've been up in some of those communities in regional Queensland which have been targeted for this, and I've said there and I've said right around the country that we don't support this extension. This comes up a lot in my own community as well. There's a lot of fear that the government is not especially well motivated here. The program began in a couple of Indigenous communities, as you know, asked for by the community, and the government, I think, has used as an excuse to go further than what communities would like to see. And so there's a lot of opposition to it. We're part of that opposition to it. We're worried about forcing people into specific outlets. We're worried about the possible extension into other areas and other pensions. And so those are all the sorts of reasons that Linda Burney and I and other colleagues have been speaking fairly robustly against it.
Great. And a really important question, one from the ACOSS team and one that I've also got written down in my notes, so we can take joint credit for this one. When will we find out, Jim Chalmers, whether Labor will support stage 3 tax cuts?
But we don't feel especially hurried about this, Stella, as people on the call would understand. These tax cuts don't come in for more than 3 years now. We said at the time that we wanted to see tax relief directed towards people who need it most and who are more likely to spend it in the economy. So the first 2 stages geared towards people on low and middle incomes. We said at the time that stage 3 was less responsible, less fair and less likely to be spent in the economy, but we were only given the opportunity to vote on the whole package together. And so we had to put a higher priority on getting tax relief out the door for people on modest incomes. The government's tax package gives, I think, almost a $12,000 tax cut to people earning more than $200,000 a year in three and a bit years down the track. Because it's a long way away, we don't feel in a rush, especially to declare our position on that. The government likes to talk about our position on that, but I feel like it's incumbent on us. It's our obligation to take the time to get that absolutely right. And not just that. But the low and middle income tax offset, some of the other changes that are happening in the tax system, as well as some of the other issues we think deserve more attention, things like a fairer way to tax multinationals and other sorts of opportunities and avenues like that. So we will take a little bit more time. I think people can expect that they'll know our view before they're asked to vote on it at some point in the next 6-12 months. But we're not in a massive rush, having only just seen what the budget looks like in the last week or so. I think it's the right and responsible thing to take our time to come to a concluded and considered view.
That's fair enough, but let me ask you this way. Has Labor decided what it will do? I mean, these tax cuts have been legislated for quite some time.
No, we haven't, and I think our position to take our time to come to that concluded view has been vindicated by the fact that when the government announced these tax cuts, debt was big and growing, but it was before the pandemic, before $1 trillion in debt, before all these other priorities, including aged care and all the rest of it, had really come onto the agenda as substantially as they are now. So I think in lots of ways, I think our caution has been warranted. It has been vindicated by the fact that the budget has changed substantially. And we need to weigh that up. We need to weigh it up against other priorities as well. In income taxes, we will always be more keen on tax cuts for people on low and middle incomes. We'll take our time to consider all the other tax cuts which have been legislated and come in more than 3 years down the track.
We've just received this from Mike Sadler. He says, place-based implementation has obvious merit, Dr. Chalmers, but will the ALP commit to immediately lifting people out of poverty by, for example, raising the rate for all welfare recipients to, for example, the aged care pension rate? Will you also allow older citizens like me, like Mike Sadler, who need to retain after 40 years in the workforce to be able to obtain employment again, and to do that without living in poverty? A very strong question there from Mike Sadler.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike, for that question. I've dealt with the job seeker part of it. On the workers that are around your age, one of the reasons why we were critical of the job maker hiring credits that ended up failing spectacularly and were the centrepiece of the government's last budget. They said there'd be 450,000 jobs created, and still it was more like 1,000. One of the reasons why we were critical of JobMaker was because it left workers, older workers, or not even just that, workers over 35, left them out in the cold and left them behind. There has been various attempts by the government to do something about older workers to try and keep them attached to the workforce, and they have failed a bit like JobMaker has as well. We're obviously doing a heap of work on this. We're worried that the biggest victims of a recession like the one we've been through are typically people at the start of their working lives and people closer to the end. And so we are putting a bit of thinking and a bit of work into that behind the scenes. And you know, if we come up with a decent policy there, then obviously we will announce it. On the place-based initiatives, I guess the point I'm making there is, I think you acknowledge, Mike, in your question is, you know, there are a range of things we need to be doing. Labour market programs, income support, but I also think when you consider how concentrated disadvantage is in this country, and I grew up amongst it here in Logan Central and the surrounding suburbs, if you recognise how concentrated it is, it really gives us an opportunity to focus in particular communities. Here in Logan Together is doing a power of work, and I want to see that replicated around the country along the lines that I described in my speech.
Now a question on a different topic. Labor has gone much further than the government on childcare and your social housing policy announced during Mr Albanese's speech last week. What about aged care, dental and mental health? What's Labor prepared to do moving forward if you were to form government at the next election?
Yeah. Look, first of all, I think on mental health, I think there are some worthy investments in the budget. I should acknowledge that. There's some good spending in the budget on mental health. Aged care feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. I feel like a lot of money was spent there, but still nothing quite substantial enough when it comes to the workforce. And so our efforts as we go through the detail of the aged care package, Mark Butler and Claire O'Neill and others, they'll go through it from a workforce perspective to see if there's more that we might be able to do. On dental, obviously, dental has been one of the most difficult parts of our otherwise universal healthcare system and Medicare. We've had various policies we've taken to recent elections, and clearly those sorts of things will be considered again, and we'll see how they stack up against some of these other priorities that we've got, including childcare, as you mentioned.
Thank you so much. We've got time for just one more. Would the ALP reinstate the parenting payment single to when your child turns 16 years instead of that brutal cutback to only 8 years? And would they increase rent assistance in line with market value rentals? And I might also just tack on, if that's okay, just one more question that you can maybe do off the back of that. Can you explain how the Future Fund generates the level of housing projected, please? Those are two audience questions, separate but perhaps you can give us one big answer to that.
Okay, sure, Stella. I'll do my best. In terms of the parenting payments single and in terms of rental assistance, obviously, in both cases, we get a lot of advocacy from ACOSS and from others on the call about that. We don't have a concluded view on those payments. Again, a bit like some of the other things I've been asked about, we'd have to weigh that up against all of the other priorities. The thing that Michael Sukkar said and the audience question said about the level of return from the Future Fund, unfortunately, is based on a fairly substantial misunderstanding of our policy in the Minister's behalf. Jason Clare Jason Clare and I were talking about this earlier today, and what he says is we're building 30,000 homes in the first 5 years, not necessarily every 5 years after that. So we make the build, and then we pay the service payments for the next 25 years. I think he's assuming that we're talking about 30,000 every 5 years forever. This is the New South Wales model. It's the model that the New South Wales Liberal government has been using to some positive effect, which we want to try and expand and make work at a national level. I think the point that Sukkar is making, Michael Sukkar, is that he thinks that we pay for those 30,000 homes in 5 years rather than over the full 25 years.
Can I ask you just really quickly, is it correct that it's 4,000 homes for women or families fleeing domestic violence, and is it 10,000 for frontline workers? Why is it less for women who need secure shelter and housing away from a dangerous situation?
Well, first of all, 4,000 is a big number, and unfortunately, as all of us know, particularly in the last year or 18 months, I just had a meeting about this the other day in my own community. The need for homes is going up, not down, but 4,000 is a massive number. There is a huge number of essential workers as well, and the difference between 4,000 and 10,000 reflects some sense of relative need.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time. That's all we have time for today. Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers there. And now it's time for Cassandra Goldie to deliver her ACOSS budget analysis.
Look, thank you, Stella. And I also do want to thank both the Assistant Treasurer, Michael Sukkar, and Jim Chalmers for their contributions this morning. Can I also really want to thank Brendan Caron for his very warm welcome to country earlier today, and to acknowledge I'm actually on Gadigal land, and indeed I'm right here in the ACOSS office, so you might be seeing the occasional ACOSS team member dashing behind me. Look, this obviously is a really important budget, and I do want to take you through a little bit of what our perspective is on the analysis of this budget, and a little bit of a response both to the Assistant Treasurer and to some of the contributions from Chalmers. So Danny is going to help me with the slides here. Danny, can I have slide 2, thanks? We got Danny there. Thanks, Danny. So, look, of course, many of you will have heard the key features of this budget, but I do want to give you just a little bit of, in case you missed it, of course, a lot of discussion about the investment in the care services, and this was an area that we had absolutely called for. Of course, after years of austerity, we knew that we were, as a very wealthy country, we had grossly underspent in key areas like aged care, childcare, mental health, and beyond. And as you'll have heard from the specialists in these areas, critical areas, all of them are saying this is all really important investment, but it will need to be more. And so this question of to what extent is the approach in this federal budget about setting a new direction for the country, or a one-off, and in fact, you know, the next time round we're going to see more austerity and cutting back, is a really big question mark for all of us. the important advocacy for many on this call, I know, of ensuring that we had the gaps filled in even existing services like the homeless services with the equal remuneration order. There was a big campaign to secure that, and that is really crucial. We're not quite there yet in terms of what's needed, but I know, for example, the homeless services were very relieved to see at least the investment there. There is this $2.7 billion in wage subsidies, and I think we've all got our work cut out for us, including particularly the government, to make sure that we actually get the right kind of approach to that. One of the things that has not been featured so much in the public commentary is the government has invested in what they're called 50 local employment programs around the country. So this is what I'm calling a kind of a seed of hope about potentially an alternative approach to supporting people who are particularly at more risk of long-term unemployment, where we've got a collaboration happening at the regional level to make sure that people are actually getting individual support that people really need to get behind you in terms of education and training, places in real workplaces. And of course, with the investment in care services, we could see better collaboration at the more regional level about where the jobs are opening up for people and what might be suitable for you if you are affected by unemployment, and the kind of training or opportunity to be in a paid workplace can be made available to you. But we're not there yet. So this is where we've all got a question mark about what is really going to be the value out of those local employment programs. And I think all of us would be wanting to be very keen to look at the detail of that. Of course, there are some really, really terrible things in this budget too, and I want to thank everybody who has called that out. The shocking decision to require now newly arrived migrants to wait 4 years to be able to access any income support at all. And I know already many are out calling for Labor to block that, for the government to revisit that. And I want to really say that we are all committed to trying to turn that decision, that proposal, it's not legislated yet, around. And of course, 144,000 people are going to be required to wait for job seeker longer. Now, we might get some more discussion in the panel about that, but we're very worried. Every day matters if you don't have access to any income. And it's, again, an example of where we're really looking to make savings off the back of people who can absolutely not afford that to happen. And of course, job seeker is just $44 a day. I want to highlight, I know that Assistant Treasurer ran the line again, which says, don't worry, people get plenty of other payments. The facts are this. When the Assistant Treasurer says 90% of people get an additional payment, the only additional payment 90% of people get is the so-called energy supplement, and that is already factored into our $44 a day assessment. So that is not correct to say that. The only other major payments that people may get are payments that have been frozen. So Commonwealth rent assistance, we've got about 40% of people who are getting that. That is only $80 per week. Find us a rental in the private rental market that is affordable with that, right? And family payments, about 11% if you've got children in your care. And that has been an area of savings in the areas of austerity since the global financial crisis. And so no question, we all know it, that actually lifting the adequacy of these key social security payments is absolutely the top priority if you want to tackle poverty and disadvantage in the community. Again, I thank everybody for not blinking on saying that that is what needs to be done. And of course, the flip side of that is what's your biggest cost is housing. We don't accept what the federal government is saying, that it's doing enough in this area. Thank you again to all those who've campaigned to say social housing is really crucial. That is what we need to see. And we don't have a federal government that has invested on that front in this budget. The other measures that the Assistant Treasurer referred to, we say, as many of the economists are saying, or will actually only drive up demand and help to inflate an already increasingly shockingly unaffordable housing market in the private sector. And so we have to get large-scale social investment into social housing. look, the completely missing in action was anything serious on closing the gap. Now the government says that it's going to, see that later. Well, I hope that $9 billion that's sitting in the, yet to be committed funds is not for electioneering purposes, but is actually for appropriating that to closing the gap and supporting the advocacy and leadership of First Nations communities around the country. Can I also highlight that there's very little on the climate front. We had advocated for a big investment in energy efficiency. If you care about people on low incomes and the cost of living and you want to do something about energy bills, one of the most important things you can do is get large-scale investment into retrofitting low-income housing across the board, and we just didn't get anything much on that at all. I've already referred to the social housing front, but can I just highlight, of course, this was a budget that was meant to put gender equality front and centre in it. Well, there was some investment. I'm going to come to these slides in just a moment to show you what that looked like. But the truth is we didn't get gender responsive budgeting. And so dollar for dollar, looking at each of the policies, the big spends and the small spends, and saying on a gender analysis, who won? Did we get gender equality out of that? So, Danny, can you just take me to the next slide? You got you there, Danny? Thanks, Danny. So this is just to show you, and yes, all these will be available to you if you want to use them, where the big dollars actually went. So plenty of commentary saying, oh, all the big spending is in care services, shock horror. Well, let's be clear, actually the biggest spends in the federal budget are personal tax cuts and business tax cuts. And then behind that is the long overdue investment into aged care. Can I highlight when the Assistant Treasurer and indeed the Chalmers also talked about the affordability of JobSeeker and the need to bring up the investment on Social Security. You can see that the JobSeeker, the increase of $25 per week, which was paltry and not enough, is the green slice there in terms of additional spend. But in fact, overall, and you heard Jim Chalmers talk about it, that he quoted the Australian Institute for Health and Welfare and said that the overall investment in the welfare spend was about $50 billion. Let's be clear, a lot of that is actually aged care and the aged pension, of course the NDIS, which is really, really important, and indeed in terms of working age Social Security payments, that is $10 billion of that spend. So, and in fact, as big, if not bigger, is the, in quotes, welfare through tax breaks for people on higher incomes of business, which is about $50 billion. So it is really important to see the relativities. And again, if you put a gender responsive budgeting lens over this pie chart here, I think it'd be a pretty interesting take. I think you would see that most of the dollars are going to men rather than to women-focused expenditure. Thanks, Danny. The next slide. So I want to highlight, of course, everybody's talking about this debate about tax cuts as if that's the main game in town. Well, it is not. Can I be very clear? We know, you know, tax cuts do not help people who need the help the most. The lowest 30% in terms of households do not get any benefit from tax cuts because your incomes are too low, and you know that, and we will continue to highlight that. And I think what's crucial also is, and if I can just flip Danny to the next slide, that the case for who needs help from a social policy in terms of income help, and of course tax cuts are often talked about helping people as well, that in terms of financial deprivation, this is really important work that was done by ANU to show that in terms of indicators of financial distress, no question, the groups that are most affected are people on job seeker type allowances. And that if you look at wages and salary, that is much lower, as is the experience for people on the age pension, because of course, for some people, many people on the age pension, they do at least have housing costs dealt with because they have home ownership behind them. That will change, no question. Next slide, thanks, Danny. So, of course, again, in this sort of the debates about tax cuts, income support, social expenditure, no question we've had a really important, in quotes, vital experiment over the last 12 months where we finally did double the rate of job seeker and overwhelmingly people spent it. They spent it in the real economy. What happened was for people who got tax cuts, people on higher incomes, many people actually saved that money. And so you'll hear in the commentary economists scratching their head, the Treasurer as well, saying, oh, households have saved 130 billion of all the help that we gave them. A lot of that was tax cuts. Well, they're people who could afford to save. What we're highlighting is that if you invest in social security and investments for people on lower incomes, you can be bang for your buck knowing that actually they will be spending it. And that, of course, helps keep other people in jobs. We need to keep saying that that is the truth, and the facts have proved that. Thanks, Danny. Next slide. Thanks, Danny. There we go. And just this is a few quotes from, can I say, mostly the Internet, IMF, OECD, and our Governor, who of course was a really key supporter in saying important social security expenditures, that these are quotes to be used to continue to advocate, for example, the kind of an approach in budget which is about fiscal policies, investing in public infrastructure like social housing and energy efficiency retrofits and health and social safety net reforms are actually being advocated by the OECD as the right way to take us through this pandemic and recovery period. Thanks, Danny. We've all, of course, ACOSS and people directly affected by the experience of unemployment care more than anybody about jobs and where those jobs are going to come from. Good quality jobs, well-paid jobs and secure jobs. The government will continue to try and justify the investment in infrastructure, for example, those big mega projects and tax cuts on the fact that they're going to help to create jobs. Well, let's be very, very clear that bang for your buck in terms of expenditures, the costs in these federal budget papers of the number of jobs created, for every job created out of infrastructure, it's going to cost about $500,000. And personal tax cuts, $390,000 per job that the federal budget papers themselves say are going to be created. No question, vital till we continue to invest in the care services area. I don't think we should necessarily celebrate the fact that at the moment, in terms of childcare, the cost of those jobs are only $50,000. We need to actually increase the valuing of those kinds of areas of work, but so important that we've got some of that investment, and we just need to continue to advocate for the right kind of approach to the next federal budget and beyond. Thanks, Stella. That's just a quick overview. My best to get through a lot of content there, and I know that we are about to have a short break. Can I just I don't know whether I've got any questions there, but we weren't planning to take any questions now. I will be sort of staying on the panel later on for people that have got some crucial questions. Can I just finally wrap up this piece by highlighting that it's both about the dollars that you receive and the way in which you are treated. And there are some small improvements in this budget, for example, the removal of the third-party verification process for single parents, which I know after a lot of advocacy from single parent groups, widely celebrated. But on the flip side of it, there's no question we've got a lot of people who are still now in a very toxic environment of heavy compliance, applying for 20 jobs a month, automation of decision-making on people, creating acute risks in terms of mental health. We've got a budget that says it wants to be all about mental health, but if you don't fix the basics, both adequate income, place to live, and some basic respect and human interaction with the way you were treated to support you whilst you are navigating a really hard labour market, it will do nothing to support your mental health. And so we will continue to push for the removal of wasteful and cruel compliance measures, things like work for the dole, cashless debit card, etc. So again, thank you to everybody that has advocated for that. Can I just now, I'm going to very quickly move to introduce you to our one of our key sponsors here, Bruce Spears from Bendigo Bank. Bruce is just going to say a few comments. I want to really acknowledge that Bendigo Bank has provided some important financial support for us and for the ACOSS network to continue with our Australian Community Sector Survey, which has been such a vital way for us to track and to continue to reflect back to all of you important resources about the constantly changing and really tough environment services, and of course for people directly affected by the issues. Thank you very much, Bruce. Welcome to you.
Thanks, Cassandra, and thanks to ACOSS for the opportunity to speak. I recognise I'm standing in between everyone in a short break, so appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts. Look, I would like to start by paying my respects to the traditional owners on the lands which we're collectively meeting. For me, I'm in Adelaide, so that is the Kaurna people. Acknowledge the ongoing commitment to their community and the importance of this for the sustainability of their culture and beliefs. For more than 160 years, Bendigo and Adelaide Banks enjoyed a really deep relationship with the communities in which we operate, and our vision is to be Australia's bank of choice, and we believe that our success is driven by our purpose, to feed into the prosperity of our customers and communities and not off it. From this model, we have the privileged position to gain a unique insight into the impact that decisions made by both the public and private sector have on Australian consumers and businesses, and in the context of today's gathering, specifically the not-for-profit sector. As Cassandra mentioned, we have a long-standing relationship with ACOSS, and building happy and healthy community is a mission that we share with ACOSS and the thousands of not-for-profit organisations who've chosen us as their banking partner. We recognise that not-for-profits play a vital role in building vibrant communities and supporting people experiencing tough times. Our commitment has extended to providing more than $251 million in community investment grants since 1998 through our globally recognised community bank model. In turn, these investments have unlocked further government and local business funding, realising community projects that have exceeded many multiple millions of dollars nationally, as well as supporting local job generation, economic growth, and some of the outcomes that Cassandra mentioned just prior. Now, being in that privileged position enables us to be a partner that truly understands the pressures and the wider needs of the community organisations, whether those partners are located in the government or private sector like us. Ahead of the release of the federal budget, there were two key trends that we were observing in our engagement with the not-for-profit sector that we saw as being relevant to the budget priorities. The first is observing firsthand the financial pressures amplified by the COVID-19 environment that not-for-profit organisations are under, having to close down retail presences, cancel fundraising initiatives, postponing events, as well as having reduced capacity to enlist the support of the business community has been an outcome of the last 12 months. And currently, these same not-for-profit organisations are under pressure to handle the increased demands for their services in local communities. We also observe the trend to greater numbers of for-profit rather than not-for-profit entities providing services in aged care and the disability sectors, which are seeing organisations having to balance the quality of care with financial returns and shareholder demands. In this space, it is heartening to see the increased commitment in the budget to improve standards, improve staffing levels, and greater accountability in the aged care sector, and the increased funding for the NDIS. In that context, more broadly, some of the highlights of the federal budget that brings to support Australia's transition from the impact and continuing challenge of COVID-19, which we see as also having a positive impact on the sector, include some of those points that Cassandra mentioned before. Efforts to address housing affordability, although there can always be more done in this space, by the creation of the Family Home Guarantee and the extension of the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme are welcome. The commitment for childcare and for second and subsequent children in particular, and the universal preschool access is also welcome. The $2 billion allocated to mental health in the wake of COVID-19 is something that we strongly support. And the additional money for the NDIS is also something that's been well received from our experience. But as I said, more can always be done. But we understand the size of the challenges in which we face into cannot be solved by just the public or private sector alone, and recognise the budget is but one component of any solution. We at Bendigo and Adelaide Bank strongly believe that partnering is an essential ingredient in solving the complex challenges of our time. Issues such as homelessness and housing affordability, climate change, rising inequality, ageing with dignity and meaningful reconciliation. These are big issues and require big solutions. From a Bendigo and Adelaide Bank perspective, we see our most impactful contribution being to continue to partner with the sector with a specific focus on those supporting initiatives associated with social and affordable housing, health, mental health, disability, training and education, and child and family support services. Bendigo and Adelaide Bank looks forward to continuing to play our part in supporting the sector to generate those positive outcomes for the communities in which we are all part of. I'd like to finish by thanking both the Assistant Treasurer and Shadow Treasurer for outlining their visions for the community and the sector, and invite them, along with my peers in the private sector, to think about how we can use our collective knowledge and experience to solve these pressing issues so Australia can realise its full potential. Thank you.
Bruce, just to say thank you, it's Cass Goldie here, just letting everybody know we're going to take a 5-minute break, and so don't go away. We'll just have a bit of a breather so you can grab your cup or your lunch or whatever you need, and we'll be back very, very shortly. Thanks. Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks, Cassandra. Cheers.
Look, hi everybody, it's Cass Goldie, and we're just coming back on now after a short break. I hope you were able to have a cup of tea and walk around or get a bit of fresh air possibly. So we're now about to go into our panel discussion, and so I just wanted to remind people to get ready to pose your questions, post them early so that we can be feeding them through as quickly as possible to people. And if you want to make a comment as well, that's really fine. Before we go into the panel session, though, I'm really delighted that we're going to be able to have a short comment from Mary Delhunty, who is Head of Impact at Hester. Hester has, of course, been a long-standing partner with ACOSS and so many supporters across our sector, and really championing the community sector as a whole. So a really warm welcome to you, Mary.
Thank you, Cassandra, and thank you everybody for having me. Hester's so pleased to be able to sponsor events such as this. I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people at the moment of the Eora Nation, which until 5 minutes ago was a really quiet spot, I thought, to do this little speech, but not so much anymore, so excuse me. But we are pleased to be able to be here. ACOSS always makes such a significant contribution to our nation, especially to those without the loudest voices. Important, of course, before the budget, but really important in this sort of forum as well, after the ink has dried on all those pages and then they've been loudly tabled in Canberra. It's important to see who the ricochet hits, and I love the work that ACOSS does at this point in time. We've got about 800,000 members, mostly working in the care economy, and they know really that a budget lays bare the values of a government, and what they need and what they deserve, certainly after the years that they've had, is true reform if they are to reach anywhere near a dignified retirement that we have our eye on. Hester members, over 80% of whom are women, need a budget that is devised by people who can understand the world through a gender lens. They can understand that spending programs, regardless of the area that they fall into, need to address the core question of how does this impact women and girls? They want a budget that's designed by people who see the opportunity and indeed the obligation they have to change the system and not change the individuals. And the ongoing pressure to consider this comes from organisations the likes of ACOSS, and none doing it better than your organisation. And it comes from Hester as well, because we have to work in partnership, and it filters throughout the outcomes to our members. I was listening in this morning and there wasn't a lot in common between the two key addresses, but except for this, that they both said that Cassandra Goldie will be at their door and ACOSS will be at their door, continuing to push for the reform that we know the sector needs. ACOSS being politically agnostic, but making the argument on behalf of all Australians, speaking for, social and community services sector, but speaking at the economy, at the system. And that's exactly what we want to see happen. So we are very happy to support this work and hope you enjoy the upcoming panel.
Thanks, Mary. Really delighted as always to have your support. It really matters. So, look, I know we're really pressed for time, and we're very privileged to have a fantastic group of panellists joining us for in part of the event today. So there are the bios available for you to read in detail. Please do. Extraordinary individuals here. So firstly, Lindon Coombes, Industry Professor, Indigenous Policy from Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at UTS. course, a really important partner. Mel Mitchell, who will be well known to many of you as a former president of ACOSS, and she's been big in the public debates about aged care as an aged care resident. We had Mel connected from her residential care facility, but she's dropped out. So we're just hoping we're going to be able to get her back in. Faye Akintoyini, who is partner and office head at Newgate Communications, and Kristen O'Connell from the Australian Unemployed Workers Union. And this panel session is going to be facilitated by very well known to all of you, Verity Firth, who's Executive Director at the UTS Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion, and a ongoing powerful advocate on so many fronts for all the issues that we're discussing today. So I'll hand over to you, Verity, and I'll be available for questions, but let's make the most of these fantastic panellists. Verity, over to you.
Thanks very much, Cassandra. And before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation today. This is the land that the university stands on. So I think we should be quick. We obviously want to get finished by the end time, and we want to hear from our excellent panellists. But there is, as Cass has already said, an opportunity for you to ask your own questions. So please start typing in the Q&A box if you have questions coming up. So we might start with, and I think that this is an important question, because really, what have we seen in this budget for First Nations people? What should have been in this budget for First Nations people?
Thanks, Verity, and I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people and thank Brendan earlier for his welcome to country. This just appeared to be a maintenance budget in terms of Aboriginal affairs. I don't know, 20 years ago when I was a junior burger working at the Department of Aboriginal Affairs in New South Wales, we were really excited on budget night. We'd stay back, order pizza, go through the papers, see what was in there. And in that intervening time, I don't know if that process has become predictable and tired and cynical, or whether I have. I suspect it's a large measure of both. But there's always sort of these really big numbers associated with the Indigenous affairs budget, big money in health, education, housing, employment, and that's difficult to argue with, and we know that they're woefully inadequate. So my issue, I guess, with the things that are in the budget, it's fairly predictable. It's fairly similar to what we've seen in previous years. And the responses are fairly predictable in that there isn't enough, particularly in health. In saying that, there has been an increase in a focus on mental health and Indigenous suicide, which I think is one of the most significant issues in this country today, particularly Indigenous youth suicide. So I think that should be applauded. And there was also extra money around women's safety and economic participation, just sort of reflective of the broader budget. But as I say, I'm always very cautious to commend these measures, particularly at this point, because we know that there's a big gap in terms of what is committed and what is implemented. And sort of going back over a period of time and looking at how Indigenous budgets have been implemented, those big numbers have not produced the results that we want, and that's again a very common recurrence theme from Indigenous people and from governments, that they're not getting the results. And so I think there needs to be a greater focus on how this money is implemented. There is a rhetoric within the government now that Indigenous people know best and should be involved in these decisions, but that's not being implemented. So I think those are the really key things. The one thing that would excite me is if there was an allocation in there for reparations. We've seen around state and territory governments now committing to processes around treaty. And if we're going to be serious about that and talk about treaty, we need to talk about reparations. And in my view, there's a significant bill that's hanging over the country that needs to be recognised sooner than later.
Yes, and we've already got some questions from the audience for you around the community development program, but I might hold that just so I can ask a question of Kristen. So Kristen O'Connell is at the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, and the way the media have been reporting this budget, Kristen, is that there's something in the budget for everyone. Yet some of the conversation we've had leading up to this panel discussion has been that for unemployed people, is that really the case? But more broadly, does this connect with the reality of the budget, the idea that this budget has something for everyone?
No, of course not. And people won't be surprised to hear me say that both Michael Sukkar and Jim Chalmers are absolutely detached from reality when they pretend that this is a big spending budget and it's not an austerity budget, and that, you know, we can simply pull people out of unemployment and above the poverty line with a welfare system that is not designed to even let you work your way out of poverty, and that somehow training people will create jobs. So the government was very clever in its strategy with slashing payments to unemployed people and people on parenting payment and people on student payments in April. So they managed to avoid the kind of media focusing on this huge cut to people, a real cut, and not only a real cut. I'm really frustrated every time I hear someone refer to this $50 change per fortnight in the rate, because it is not an increase. People are $15 further below the poverty line than they were last February. The poverty line increased by $5 a day during the pandemic. So there is no way that people, the several million people, including their kids, who depend on payments, are winners in this budget. And we've been given no hope from the Labor Party. We do not trust the government to look after people. And at the moment, unemployed people are quite despairing.
Right, and we'll get back to some further digging into that as well. Unfortunately, Merle is still having trouble connecting, so we won't be able to go to Merle next, but I would like to throw to Faya Kandoini, and it's a little bit related to what Kristen's just been talking about. There have been areas of movement, right? So we've seen, admittedly, a rather paltry increase to the permanent rate of job seeker in April. So although, you know, it's obviously not as much as we want, and it is essentially a large cut from the March rate, there is an increase. There's a women's budget statement. There is increased investment in care services. And what some of the ACOSS people have been reporting is that it's almost like the government has managed to neutralise these issues, that we're already seeing decreasing focus in the public's debates around this issue. What's the strategy for people like us to continue to achieve much needed change in these areas?
It's a good question, Verity. What you've got to remember about it is there's a general belief that people only have so much bandwidth for what they call political issues. And a lot of the things you're talking about, like budgets and things, for most audiences are their special niche, even though they're affecting them personally. So the approach the government is potentially taking is, at any given issue, there is 5 to 15% who are focused on it and support it, 5 to 15% who are focused on it and oppose it, and basically vast majority of us in between, somewhere between 10 and 60%, don't know, don't care. So, and they're relying on the don't know, don't care as thinking job done. So the key word, I think Lindon used it coming out of the gate, or I think probably everybody on this panel will use it at some point, is cynical. They've taken a very cynical approach by believing that by appearing to address the issue, that the vast majority of voters think it's job done. So it means that there's a communication education gap that people on this call have to play in the forthcoming months.
Yes, and I suppose this is the start of it, just getting information out about the budget. So another area, of course, where there was sort of an incredible lack of action, especially considering the urgency of the situation, is around climate change. I know in ACOSS's own briefing, ACOSS pointed out the budget included $35.5 billion over 4 years in fossil fuel tax credits, $58.6 million for the gas industry, and $539.2 million for 5 hydrogen hubs and carbon capture and storage projects that aim to prolong the life of the fossil fuel industry. How do we shift the dial in this area? I might go first to you, Lindon.
There's probably quite a few ways of coming at that, but the answer has, to my view, been obvious for a very long period of time. It's only clouded by political donations and political obligations arising out of those. We've seen examples of this in other countries. It is eminently doable, and actually, you know, the arguments around our dependence on these fossil fuels have never stacked up. There has been, again, a very cynical approach to this issue, and we're actually being left behind. We have an opportunity, still do have an opportunity within renewables and a range of other areas to really benefit the country long term, but our short-term outcome, our short-term political views, they're just not allowing it, and it's incredibly frustrating.
So Faye, as a strategist, what would you suggest? How do we shift the dial in this area?
I think you kind of have to go to the second thing about this is the government did a really good job in the 2019 elections of actually reframing climate change to actually be an employment issue. And we just let it happen. In fact, we played into it. So I suspect that a lot of the people on this call have a particular mission or purpose to their organisations, but those missions or purposes have been drafted in an incredibly myopic way. Very little perspective around what the broader issues are, or who people who don't believe think or feel, or what they care about. And as a result, you have a tendency to get blindsided when people run quite clever campaigns and shift the goalposts. And the reaction levers that tend to occur are protest, outrage, furious social media exchanges amongst yourselves, all of which the government does not give 2 cents about. So if you want to shift and get their attention and get them to care, you actually have to look like you are creeping into the don't know, don't cares that they care about. So you actually have to start to focus on their people who vote for them, not people who vote Green, not people who vote Labor, not even people, or potentially people who have gone independent because they're looking for a safe harbour for their mandatory vote. But you actually have to start talking the language of the people who vote for the coalition.
Wow, it's a challenge. Kristen, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, so much. I actually think that we need to approach these issues with a bit more complexity and acknowledge the complexity. I do actually think that climate change is an employment issue. And I would say that we have hundreds of thousands of people entering the work for the dole phase of unemployment right now, and they are going to be put into forced labour programs where they do not get paid, and the organisations that are hosting those people are not paying for that labour. What we should be seeing is, instead of displacing people in the workforce, we should be saying, well, let's have actual real jobs created where people are given the opportunity to care for country, where people are given the opportunity to create new infrastructure that will help us transition to a net zero economy. And obviously, it's very convenient for the government to suggest that changing our economy in that way will cost jobs. But in reality, we see evidence constantly being put out that we'll actually have more jobs if we do make this transition more rapidly. Everything is possible. They are just making choices. They are choosing to put people into poverty. They are choosing to throw us all under the bus, those of us who are still going to be here in 50 years, when they could be making the choices to do the opposite without hurting the economy, which, you know, is not something that I think is the most important thing. But for those who do, I think it's very easy to make this case, as long as we emphasise that justice can go in concert with, you know, economic health and recovery.
Yeah. And what about social housing, Kristen? We heard Jim Chalmers talk a bit about Labor's commitment. In terms of the government's approach, which really isn't about social housing, it's more about subsidising purchase into the private sector, is this a opportunity lost? What's your view on social housing and housing affordability?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I just want to point out on housing is that the crisis services funding that the government is claiming is an increase is actually just replacing money that they cut last October. So there has been no investment in crisis services. In terms of housing overall, yeah, people who can access the schemes that the government who have announced are not going to be people who are currently living in poverty, because you still need to be able to get a loan and make repayments on that loan. The Labor Party announcing, I mean, it's quite confusing with their communications, whether it's 20,000 homes or 30,000 homes. It's very technocratic what they're talking about. Any increase in social housing is great. I think we need to be speaking much more boldly about public housing, about saying that we should be, you know, it's frustrating to see, again, the opposition leader talk about growing up in public housing, but not understanding that where we are now is very different to where we were then. The homes that people live in now are the same ones they were living in the 60s, and they haven't been maintained. We need more public housing stock, not less. So hopefully we can get some slightly bolder vision before the next election, but it's certainly, it doesn't give many people hope at the moment when we're talking about the number of people in rental stress and the, more than 100,000 people at least, sorry, I don't have that number off the top of my head, who are on the waiting list for public housing.
Yes. Lindon, do you have views about the opportunity wasted created by the social housing issue?
Yeah, indeed. It's sort of just like, I imagine, like the rest of Australia, it's one of the key issues for Indigenous people, has been for a long time, particularly remote housing, affordable housing, and actual livable housing when you're in remote areas. Just having air conditioning in houses has only recently sort of been accepted for those people out there. And just as Kristen was saying, Indigenous people experience all of these issues. They're just a little bit more acute for a whole range of issues. And yes, the social and public housing is, a big priority for Indigenous people.
Yeah, and Faye, I know I keep asking you the sort of strategy questions, but surely housing, like you were talking before about needing to pitch to the voters that may potentially vote Conservative, surely housing affordability is one of those issues. Like, it is a chronic problem in all the major cities, and surely this is something that the left of centre can win on.
You'd like to think so, Verity, but again, I think it's a case of we all tend to spend a little bit too much time with people we like, and we need to really disrupt ourselves and go out there and actually catch up with people who we don't normally would catch up with, because the perspective out there is housing affordability to the peri-urban fringe of Australia is not about taxpayer-funded housing. It's about whether they can actually afford to rent or buy in the areas that they live or work. And that applies all across capital cities. And if you look at it from a social marketing perspective, usually is a way, we've had 100 years of basically dealing with social issues by saying, historically, can we ask people to take a personal pain for a social gain? We now have a government who is very comfortable with the concept of people taking personal gain for a social pain. It's been flipped completely, and there is no shame in it, which is the part that I suspect most people on this call would find hard to get their heads around. So you have to really look at it from their perspective, because you're not going to convert them, but you have to disrupt their playbook. And that's about being honest about what that playbook is. So affordable housing is not about getting people off the streets, homeless people off the streets. It's not about giving safe homes to women who are leaving domestic violence. Affordable housing in the minds of what we like to call as working class Australia is them actually being able to afford a home. And the government makes them think they're in competition with the sectors we're talking about, even though they're not.
Yes, that's very true. So I've been asked to prompt the audience, because we do have more opportunities for questions of our panel, and I'll run out of questions at some point. So I'll continue to ask my questions, but please do write in the Q&A box. I might go to one that has come in from the audience, and I'm going to go to you first, Lindon, which is a question around the community development program, which of course the government did announce that they were ceasing with this budget. And the question is, what would be the best thing to replace it?
Yeah, I was saying at the start it was largely a fairly predictable budget. That was a little curveball in there, just because I don't know where they'll go with it. And like with most things in Indigenous affairs and social policy, they need to go back. It's all cyclical. And when this started out with the CDP and we had ATSIC and the thing was well resourced, there was genuine work given to people. It was good. Was it the best administered program? Probably not, but when you put it against the calibre of administration of this government, I think it stands pretty good. So going back to a proper CDP, which it was when it started, I know from my mum's community in Brewarrina, it brought immense improvements to the community. People were really proud about getting out every day and working and improving their community. And so it had a much more benefit than just, the payment for that. And when we do this again, I would hope that it's set up properly so that people get paid super, because they didn't, that they have proper insurance. And again, this is another real opportunity where there is some investment in community and communities thrive from it. I think, again, it's the government's ideology and resentment of any form of welfare just precludes them from being innovative and actually just listening to and building on an evidence base in these things. So it's been done before. It's, again, a matter of political will and choice.
So, Kristen, do you have any views on what could potentially replace the community development program?
Yeah, and I think it's important that when we talk about this, we acknowledge that the CDP is just one part of the welfare system that is continuing to inflict colonial violence on First Peoples in this country. Black folks are always discriminated against more in the social security system than everyone else. So the CDP sort of being drawn to a close is really important, and it is going to hopefully alleviate pressure on a lot of people. In the first quarter of this year, there were 18,000 payment suspensions. There are 30,000 people on CDP. So it's disgraceful that so many folks have been cut off their payment. So it's what we want to see is firstly immediate suspension of it. Replacing it means self-determination for communities, listening to folks and what they've been saying for so long, which is we want to determine what happens in our community, and that is going to be different in different places. It's going to respond to local context. These should just be jobs. If there is work to be done and the community wants to do that work, there should be jobs. If there are skills gaps in the community, they should be supported to have training. People shouldn't be forced to fall out of the income support system or forced to relocate simply because of these systems and settings.
Faye, do you have anything to add on that?
No, not really. I agree with Kristen in terms of the continual segmentation of these particular programs in artificial constructs just allows the government to give permission, because it says, this is the bucket of people who don't vote for us, and therefore we don't actually have to take their needs seriously, and that's a can we will definitely kick really hard down the road. And remember, when they first disrupted the CDP, which was a long time ago now, it really had been a program that had built incredible trust. It was the cornerstone of so many communities and was delivering in more social terms, but that didn't seem to matter. So yeah, I think this is the other thing that goes with, and it comes out a lot, and it's, the danger is for all of us to become cynical as well, because, as they say, a cynic is a romantic who's been disappointed too many times. And I think by falling into that cynicism, we expect the worst, we get righteously angry. None of that is productive use of our energy. I really do encourage people over the next 6 to 12 months, which is somewhere where we're going to have an election, people think about how they focus their energy on productive things. Push their emotional buttons, don't get emotional. Okay, play a local campaign game. So no coalition MP can appear at the opening of a fridge in their electorate, not with a protest, but with some actual example of the consequences of some of these policies put in front of them. Preempt them visiting, because they tell everybody on social media when they're showing up back in the electorate. Preempt that by doing some really good local media and social media work amongst the community. But it's not designed to put on a protest, because a protest is easily dismissed. It's designed to push their emotional buttons so they realise that the community, the electorate, is still alive to all these things in the budget that just did not deliver.
So the audience are now getting all keen. So the call for questions has worked. The next question is actually a nice link back to the sort of community building aspects of the CDP program, because one audience member asks, I'd like to hear from the panellists about Jim Chalmers' priority on place-based approaches. What do you see are the opportunities and challenges of implementing this on a large scale, particularly around sector collaboration? So who wants to go first to talk about place-based approaches? Faye, you haven't gone first for a while.
I'm completely comfortable with that, Verity, thanks. It does play to my point about local, it really does. And the other, I mean, I had three kind of things that, you know, that could be game changers. And some of you already do these things, but probably not as well as you think you do. As I say, play on two fields. So you basically, you walk and chew gum. You play the national, but then you play the local. The national is for the consistent messaging, but the local is for the disruption. You disrupt them in terms of making them uncomfortable, not protesting, but doing things which they think their support base are aware of. So you've expanded your reach. So programs which are place-based, you know, investment around that, which doesn't talk to fairness. This government clearly has never shown you a moment in which fairness triggered any kind of a response. So what you want to think about is how does it actually talk to equity and good management of taxpayer funds? I mean, the chart that Cassandra shared earlier around the hard hats are expensive, that was brilliant. But you know what a simple tweaking of that is? The infrastructure and personal tax rates, they should be red, because they're the expensive overspend. And mental health, aged care and childcare should be blue, because that's the good use of taxpayer money. Use the traditional symbols against them. They think they own blue. They'd be quite happy with that chart. So it's kind of like you have to kind of like really disrupt. And the other thing is make it feel like that you've got more political power than you actually feel like you have. So look coordinated, even when you're not. Okay, so that's, you know, don't get caught up joining, or well, not joining, but becoming movements and campaigns, but run like you are a movement and campaign across multiple fronts. That scares them more, because they can dismiss one logo, really hard to dismiss 17.
Lindon,
so those kind of perception things. Sorry, that's my kind of like take on perceptions.
Yeah, I like it. Lindon, place-based initiatives, and I thought that Jim Chalmers stuff was interesting too, about prioritising place-based and trying to roll that out at scale. What's your view on that?
Yeah, well, sort of go back again, as we were talking about the sort of golden years of CDP, such as they were, but in those days of ATSIC was operated on a regional level, and some of those regions survive to this day, areas like Maripaki, because they are natural social and economic interactions. It just works. It's kind of organic. So again, not saying that we told you so, but that's how Indigenous people have operate. You know, they play footy in their regions. They interact with people. They have family members within those regions, and that's how they operate. And it just seems natural way of going about these types of things and being effective.
Now, I'm mindful of the time and I want to give Cass an opportunity to sum up. So I'm going to ask the final question from the audience and I'm going to come
Verity,
to...
can I be cheeky? I just
Yes.
want to chip in. Hi, it's Cass. Just on the place-based bit, and Kristen, you might have something to say about it too. But I think all of that's right, Lyndon. I think, though, we've got to recognise that you need a floor. You need a floor so that Social Security really matters. And the, affordable roof over your head, the really basics of life matter, and place-based approaches can't replace that aspect of it. And that's where I think there'll be some questions about what's really the Labor Party saying, in terms of it can't be an either-or approach here.
Thank you, Cass, because, sitting here as a person on a poverty payment, I've got to say the idea of a sophisticated and complex solution to people who are living on income support doesn't, again, fill me with hope. The first step is raising income support above the poverty line, and then we absolutely need to be designing really sophisticated responses that are locally led, so not just place-based, but community-led and community designed. So it's it's quite academic to be hearing people talk about place-based solutions when for most unemployed people it just doesn't reflect our lived reality, about what's important day to day.
Yeah. All right. So final question to you, Kristen, and it's around the so-called women's budget. You might have seen it up in the chat already. So it fell short in so many ways. We can see that short-term support solutions have been announced rather than structural changes to support women, particularly in the area of domestic violence. This is evidenced in that whilst a $250 million per year increase in funding is guaranteed across most of the forward estimates, this is then cut by 99% in 2025 to 26. What else do we need to do as activists to demonstrate the vital importance of these services to support some of our most vulnerable in the community? The pandemic clearly showed the impact of this. Why can't we get traction on structural change? Kristen.
I am going to sound like a broken record. Structural change means payments above the poverty line, which then sets everyone up to be able to at least have a better starting place, right? So we know that the thing that causes the most harm to women in this country are these disgraceful payments that trap people, and not just women, but younger people specifically, and particularly queer folks, in unsafe homes, because the payment is either not enough to get out, or because of the rules around partner income tests, you can't even get a payment at all. So if we actually had people having just a little bit more money and not having their payment dependent on their partner's income, they would actually be able to have a better chance to get out of that situation and not necessarily be so heavily dependent on crisis services. Crisis services, mental health services, close the gap funding are band-aids on problems that are fundamentally going to be ameliorated to a large extent if people just have enough money to live. That's literally what we're talking about. But in our welfare system, we've got the number of people over 50 is, off the top of my head, I think it's like 330,000 people. There are 160,000 primary carers, so parents and carers. There is really different challenges for people who are working very hard already, and trapped in this system because they're doing unpaid work, and particularly that affects women. It affects everyone in the system, but it disproportionately harms women in so many ways.
Faye and Lindon, would you like to have your final words for the panel? Anything to add around the women's budget in particular? Lindon.
No, I don't have anything to add. On top of what Kristen said, I think that was great. If I could have a very quick rant about the basics card, though, that what an appalling thing it is. I think it's the most appalling. It actually flies in the face of liberal ideology and philosophy about personal freedom, about personal responsibility, about participating in the mainstream economy, all of these things that have been drilled into Indigenous people. That policy flies in the face of it. It is appalling, and where they say that Indigenous communities have wanted it, I don't think we can trust that, because they don't have a genuine way of engaging with Indigenous people to understand what we want. And I just wanted to get that in. Thank you.
Good on you, Lindon. And last word from you, Faye.
I think one of the interesting parts about today is how much information that this government has built its campaign on is still misinformation. And there probably is a role for a one-pager top 10 myth busting coming out of the budget, particularly around the 44 and those kinds of things. I think that would be a really helpful piece of fact dropping in. Remembering, of course, facts won't change anybody's view, but they will make it harder for them to recruit supporters.
Excellent. Thanks, Faye. And over to you, Cass, to take it out.
Thanks, Verity. And can I just on the that last question, which is such an important question about continuing to push hard on the issues of gender equality, gender-based violence, and sexual harassment. I think it is really important for us to note that almost, the federal budget delivered, and what is everybody talking about in terms of the public commentary? It's all back to deficit, debate, surplus, etc. And so this momentum is never something we can take for granted. So I don't think everybody can see that. I do think in terms of what can we do next, is we absolutely need to call out the gender inequality in this budget and the dollars and cents, that further analysis, making sure that we're briefing the journos, that they've got the facts and we're calling them out when they don't use them. And so, for example, ACOSS is going to do our best effort to do some of that gender breakdown very shortly. That'll be coming out, and I know the National Foundation of Australian Women and others are also doing some further work on that. Can I also say that there's been a lot of defending the spend that is seen as expenditure to tackle gender equality. And I keep saying, let's talk about where it actually, the big spend, which is over in the more men's business area, and keep staying there. Let us get them to justify their tax cuts, because you can see that actually they're pretty indefensible. So Faye, I like the tip on the colouring bit. Let's see what we can do there. Can I just finally wrap up by saying there's many thank yous. I want to personally thank everybody who has joined us today. Lots of great questions, and I know that people have been engaged in a lot of different ways and participated. Thank you to Brendan Karen for his welcome to country at the beginning. Can I thank you in particular, Lindon, for your ongoing First Nations leadership. We are absolutely committed here in solidarity to backing in every move you and your colleagues are making about the sort of the advocacy on the Voice Parliament, to the Uluru Statement overall, and to the shocking rates of deaths in custody, and the serious business. So we just continue to extend our hand as an ally in solidarity to work with you every step of the way in terms of keeping the pressure on. Let's have a look at that $9 billion that's sitting in the budget, what they're going to do with it. Can I also thank our great MC Stela Todorovic earlier on today. She is absolutely following these issues, and as a political correspondent, to Faye's point about getting the message out in places where we don't often necessarily spend the time. It's really fantastic, Stella. Thank you so much for you continuing to offer to do this today, and also to continue to follow the stories. Can I thank the other panellists as well. Mel, we missed you. I don't know whether you're watching this in some way now. We're not able to get Mel back, but if there's any way any of you can get a message to Mel Mitchell to thank her for her advocacy on the aged care reforms. She's been phenomenal, along with many others, and it's not finished yet, but I know Mel did want to have a say about that today, and we really missed you. Faye, thank you. Always sharp and interesting and challenging for us, so that's what we like, a bit of that, to think differently. And Kristen, thank you. Really powerful, sharp as a tack. Thank you for your contributions at the community sector presser post the budget as well. Really important, and for all the work that you do. Verity, thank you. I know that we'll continue. We didn't get to talk about the situation for higher education and the deep inequities and having left universities on the shelf, but maybe that's another webinar that we can do together. Thank you to Bendigo Bank, Hester, of course, UCS Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion, and our media partner Pro Bono. Danny Prevatera, who is the ACOSS Events and Engagement Officer. Powerful, wonderful. Thank you for all of your organising and all the rest of the ACOSS team. If you didn't see them dashing behind me here, it's because they've all been sitting at their computers helping to make it work at the back end, and all the great, wonderful policy analysis and work that you've done. Absolutely, last but not least, I want to particularly acknowledge and thank people directly affected, people with in the jargon of the moment, the lived experience, the realities of life, and continuing to be courageous and speaking up and calling out what you see and the realities of life in Australia, because there's no question that what's happened through this pandemic is that we have got some people who have accumulated extraordinary wealth. They don't know what to do with their cash at the moment, and that's driving up housing prices. And on the other hand, we absolutely have austerity for people on the lowest income in this country and going backwards. And so we commit to continue to do everything we can as ACOSS, as the ACOSS network. Thank you all for your participation today, and we're only 3 minutes over. So thank you to everybody at the back end of this event who helped to make it all come together. Till the next one. Bye.